Learn how easy it is to get started with Azure Arc enabled SQL Server, going all the way back to SQL Server 2012. This week on Data Exposed. Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this episode of Data Exposed. We have the one and only Bob Ward joining us today. Bob, thanks so much for joining us on Data Exposed. Yet again, it's been just a minute since we've had you on the show, but we're super excited to have you here.
And it's always a pleasure to be on your show. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Great. And today the topic is Azure Arc enabled SQL Server. Now, this is something we've done episodes about before, but it's been a while and we wanted to check in and get your perspective on Azure Arc enabled SQL Server and also learn what's new because there's been a ton of new things in this space. So Bob, can you tell us a little bit more about this service?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Just to remind your audience here, you've got existing SQL Server installations today, all the way back from even maybe 2012. And you're thinking about maybe connecting it to Azure. Now, these SQL servers could run on your on-premises environment or even other clouds, but you'd like to say, hey, can I just connect to Azure and get something for it? So that's why we call it Azure Arc enabled SQL Server, because we're taking an existing SQL server and enabling it by bridging or arcing yourself to Azure. And you're right, there's new stuff. Look at all this. Like, how about being able to do a pay-as-you-go license for a SQL server? We announced that last November as part of the SQL Server 2022 launch, but it's available for any version of SQL Server we support for Azure Arc. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end, Anna, but that's a pretty big groundbreaking feature that's been added to this lineup. How about a free inventory of your instances and databases? I have a cool demo to show on that one. We even things like best practices assessment to get configuration advice from Microsoft based on your installation. Now we just announced this one, automated backups and patching of your SQL servers. That really popular Defender for SQL service for things like vulnerability assessments, advanced threat protection, and new for SQL 2022, Azure Active Directory Authentication and Purview Access Policies. And to be clear, Anna, you're not deploying SQL Server in Azure. You're just connecting SQL Server Azure and getting these type of services.
And that's awesome, Bob. But one thing you mentioned that caught my attention, you said SQL Server 2012. Can I use this with SQL Server 2012?
I know. We're going to go back to previous releases of SQL Server and allow you to connect it to get some of these services. Some of them are only available with like recent versions, but even like pay-as-you-go license can go all the way back to older releases. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Wow, cool. Okay, I'm going to save my pay-as-you-go license question because I don't know what that is because I heard you prepared some demos.
I did. You want to see some demos of this stuff?
Yeah, let's take a look.
I always have demos for you, Anna. Always good demos.
Great.
Let's see it. So let's say right here, if you got an example, I've got a SQL 2022 I've connected to Azure. Now I'm in the Azure portal, but notice I'm seeing my SQL server, which is not deployed in Azure. I can see a pay-as-you-go license with addition of SQL Server. Look at this though. Here's a list of all the databases I've deployed when they were created. I can even drill into a database and see really important properties about the database, like what's the compat level and what's the last backup of this database. So each database property I can see, I'm doing all of this, Anna, for free, just by connecting a SQL Server to Azure. I haven't paid Microsoft anything yet. Just connect myself and see some interesting information. Now, to see one database at a time, that's kind of cool. How about something like this? Let me flip over another part of my portal here. What if I could show you, like, using something called Kusto query, I could look across all my SQL servers and all my databases and give you like a histogram of DB compat levels. This way I could tell, like, what are the compat levels I need to kind of look at across my enterprise, which ones maybe I need to pull up to like maybe newer versions or which one to keep on older versions. So, and again, this is all free. This is part of our free inventory. How about this one? How about which databases haven't been backed up? Anna, you wouldn't believe this, but I've run into customers where this happens. They haven't backed up their databases. They don't know which ones. I can, by connecting to Azure, all my SQL servers, I can tell across every SQL server I have, do I have any haven't been backed up yet? Or I can do other types of interesting queries here across all sorts of properties for my instance or my database. Again, all free.
Wow. Is it pretty hard to set this up, Bob?
No, it's easy. Look, it's so easy as this. In SQL 2022, it's part of the setup process. So when you set up SQL Server, you can say, here's my Azure subscription. I just want to connect myself to Azure. We use these agents that are installed in your virtual machine to connect. But yeah, and then there are scripts available as you do as well. if you're running on older versions of SQL Server. So it's pretty easy to set this up and connect.
Nice.
There's more. There's all sorts of things we could show here today, right? But I mentioned best practices assessment. So let me show you this one over here. I've already run this on a SQL Server. How would it be kind of cool if you could take the advice of Microsoft, run or schedule an assessment to look at the configuration of your SQL Server or your databases and get some interesting results? Like, am I far off from doing the best practices? That could actually really save me a lot of time, money, and effort later. So first of all, you look here, as I clicked on my assessment, I'm looking at kind of like a graph. Which ones have passed? Which ones have issues? What's the priority of these issues? And then a categorization. If you see to the right over here, there's a couple of interesting examples, like instant file initialization and locked pages are two configuration options that people look at all the time. But I could see errors that have occurred in my system, or maybe tempDB is not configured properly for the best I/O. I can even see things like fragmentation information at the database table level of my database. So a lot of rich information about best practices. One thing I like about this feature, though, as I run this, is kind of like the reporting piece of it. So I can see what new issues have popped up since my last run, which ones have I resolved, and I love insights. What are the most reoccurring issues that are happening across all my databases and SQL servers? So the cool thing about this too as well, though, you're not paying for like the best practice service or anything like that. You just pay what's called a log analytics workspace, which is really inexpensive. And you start running this assessment and scheduling to see things across time, across your database or instance. So a couple of cool examples of just stuff we're doing here with Azure Arc.
Yeah, super cool. So another question on this is, I've seen this before for SQL Server and Azure VM. Is this the same sort of assessment that's being run?
How cool is that? It's all based on the SQL Assessment API. So yes, we've got a common experience now across running SQL Server and Azure VM and your SQL servers that are connected with Azure Arc.
Nice. That is awesome. Bob, the other thing, I had mentioned this earlier, you mentioned pay as you go. As a SQL Server person, that's not something I thought was possible, right? Unless you were using like Azure SQL Database in the cloud. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, let me show. I got a slide here that kind of summarizes this, and you've kind of nailed it in the head. Somebody's looking to maybe do things like, instead of capital expenditure, like operational expenditures. And so they would normally go run a SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machine or Azure Database to do as like a pay per core, pay per hour, pay monthly type model. Well, some of our customers said, like, I would like that same experience wherever I'm running SQL Server, whether it be on premises or even another cloud. And now we offer that. So by configuring with Azure Arc and saying, I'd like a pay-as-you-go license, you use your Azure subscription and you pay Microsoft on a per hour, per core basis, even if SQL Server is running in your environment. So I mentioned that operational expenditure scenario. What about the ability to have like not upfront costs? So you're getting that feel of getting billed like you're in Azure. And what's really interesting, Anna, is this third scenario. Look at the chart right here. So let's say I have SQL servers that are not 100% utilized across months or each month. So you can see right here by this chart, let's say I only use a SQL Server, and we've got some examples here, ERP payroll scenarios. Maybe I use it like half the month or 33% of the month or something. You can see it'll be cheaper to do a pay-as-you-go license instead of using your existing SQL Server licenses. So this is not Azure Hybrid Benefit. This is literally just doing a pay-as-you-go license in your environment, just like you're running inside of Azure using your Azure subscription. And again, on premises or other clouds, this all works as long as you can connect using Azure Arc with SQL Server.
That's pretty cool, Bob. It kind of reminds me, this chart kind of reminds me of the serverless model, except now it's like a license list or like pay-as-you-go type of license. So super cool that we're kind of enabling customers to use what they need and try to minimize any overpayment, in this case of licenses. As we start to wrap up, what are some key tips and tricks on how to get started with this thing? I know you mentioned it wasn't too difficult.
Yeah, it can be easy. So look at our link up here at the top that we have for you. That's a great way to get started by looking just the documentation wherever your environment is. First of all, one thing is interesting about this, because we've had customers say like, well, I got 100 SQL servers. Do I have to like click this one at a time? No, we have onboarding scripts to connect at scale. So you can say, I got 100 SQL servers. I'd like to enable them for Azure Arc across all of those. But we have something called the Azure extension for SQL Server, which these scripts will use. And in SQL Server 2022, it's integrated into the setup experience, whether you do that through the GUI or the command line. But there's also a set of scripts for you to do and deploy that. And what's really neat about this, Anna, is you can go to the Azure portal and do this. You say, oh, I'd like to enable my SQL Server with Azure Arc, and then we will give you the onboarding script to pull down in your environment to connect. And then one thing that's interesting about this Azure Arc model is there's this concept called Azure Arc servers, like a Windows server or a Linux server. And so if you've already got your Windows server or Linux server enabled with Azure Arc using their technology, we will actually try to go find those and give you a notification to say, hey, by the way, we noticed you got a SQL Server running here. Would you like to connect that to Azure Arc as well? So a lot of easy ways to get started. Check out our documentation. We find this to be a very simple process. Anna, we need to come back on the show like 6 months later. We are just getting started in this model. Like, what if we could do things like monitoring or improve that whole business continuity model and so forth? So look for us to be able to, create more functionality on Azure Arc as we go forward. And we don't need to release a new version of SQL Server to do it. So we can innovate here quite frequently with Azure Arc enabled SQL Server.
Wow. Well, Bob, thanks so much for coming on the show. I think we might have just gotten a sneak peek at the roadmap. So that's pretty exciting. We'll have to have you back on the show in a couple of months. To our viewers, go ahead and we'll put this link in the description for you to learn more. So go ahead, check it out, see how easy this might be to set up and configure and start getting the advantages of Azure wherever your SQL servers are running. If you like this episode, go ahead, give it a like, leave us a comment, and let us know what you think. And we hope to see you next time on Data Exposed.